Hey, geometry students, how you doing? This is Mr. Hartz coming at you. Today we're starting a new unit, Unit 7. We're going to be looking at coordinate geometry. So we're going to take some of the things that we already know how to do and apply these geometrical principles to the coordinate plane. Hopefully you find this to be pretty straightforward and easy to work with. And as long as you just are careful about a couple things, this should be very simple. Let's start by looking at a segment in the coordinate plane. So here's what it says. A segment has endpoints of 1, 2, and 7, 6. Find the coordinates of the midpoint. Okay, well, first thing I'm going to do is going to plot those endpoints. So I'm going to plot 1, 2. Just as a reminder, on our coordinate plane, this is the x-axis. This is the y-axis. Points are always given in the form x, comma, y. So that first endpoint is 1, 2. So I go to 1 on the x and 2 on the y, and I'll plot that right here. Then to plot the second point, I'm going to go to 7 on the x-axis and 6 on the y-axis. So this is my segment right here. And what I want to do is I want to find the midpoint. Well, that word, midpoint, we already know what that means. That's one of the first things we talked about way back in August of 2019. Well, we know a midpoint cuts it into 2 equal pieces. So what we want to do is we want to figure out where that point would be and how we can find that point without always sketching the line. So when I take a look at this, right, if I want to look for the midpoint, I want to look somewhere as close to perfectly in the middle as I can find. Okay, well, when we take a look at this, right, I would identify right in the middle, looks like it'd be right about here. So my estimate would be the point 4, 4. Okay. And in fact, that will end up being the midpoint. We're going to talk about how we find that. Okay, well, we have this segment, right? And it changes, like the endpoints are different, have different x's and different y's. And what I want you to think about is the midpoint, right? Has to be right in the middle of the x values, and it has to be right in the middle of the y values. Right? So we want to think, oh, I probably extended that just a little too far. Let me just erase that. Right in the middle of the, right in the middle of the x values, right to the middle of the y values. So I want to figure out what number then is right in the middle of those 2 x values, 1 and 7. Right? Well, we can like count backwards and say, okay, I'm going to just move towards the middle, right? So from 1 and 7, I'm going to move to 2 and 6. I'm going to move to 3 and 5. And then I'm going to end up at 4. That's 4 is right in the middle of 1 and 7. Similarly, looking at the y values, if I start at 2 and 6, I go to the middle. That's 3 and 5. And again, 4 is the exact middle. Okay, so we've got the midpoint. I can find the x part. We want to find what's right in the middle of these 2 x values. To find the y coordinate, I want to find what's right in the middle of these 2 y values. And that gives me 4. Now, to figure out what's right in the middle of 2 numbers is called an average, right? So what I want to do is, instead of always having to sketch this, right, or count off to figure out what the midpoint is, there's a much easier way to do it, right? What we know is the x midpoint is just the average of the 2 x endpoints. The y midpoint is the average of the 2 y endpoints. So to think of it that way, my x midpoint would be the average of my 2 x endpoints. How do I average things in math? Well, I add them up and divide by 2. 1 plus 7 is 8. 8 divided by 2 is 4. And that gives me my x midpoint of 4. Find the y midpoint, right? I want to average the y's. So I want to take this y and this y, and I want to add them up and divide by 2. 2 plus 6 is 8. 8 divided by 2 is 4. And I always want to write my midpoint as a coordinate. So I want to write it as the point 4. And anywhere on the coordinate plane, right? I showed you one in quadrant 1, but this works anywhere in the coordinate plane. The x midpoint is always equal to the average of the endpoints, x endpoints. The y midpoint is always the average of the y endpoints. So here's what I want you to do just for a convention and to make an equation. Let's go ahead and write down the midpoint formula. Okay, first off, endpoints we're always going to call x1, y1, and x2, y2. There are always two endpoints to a segment. So one of them is called x1, y1. The other one is called x2, y2. The midpoint, which is right in between those two endpoints, I'm going to always call x sub m, y sub m. For x midpoint, y midpoint. And the formula is, okay, and I want you to write, there's two formulas here. One formula is to calculate the x midpoint. I know that equals the average of the two x endpoints. I average things by adding them together and dividing by 2. So that's part 1 of the midpoint formula. Part 2 is going to look exactly the same, but it's going to have y's. The y midpoint is the average of the y endpoints. Okay? And thinking about it this way and just remembering, oh, a midpoint is simply an average, I remember to add the two endpoints and divide by 2 to give me the midpoint. Okay? And I want you to memorize this whole formula. Again, a lot of students only remember x1 plus x2 over 2. If you only memorize the right side of these equations, you're going to have a hard time doing some of the more challenging problems. Okay? But if you remember the whole equation for both of them, you're going to do a lot better. Let me show you a couple of problems that we can do without using a coordinate plane then. Okay, so here's a problem. Example 1. A segment with endpoints of -4, 3 and 1. A segment with endpoints of -4, 3 and 10, 1, a midpoint. Find the coordinates of the midpoint. Okay. Now, anytime you're given these problems, right, there's 3 things that we have to consider. There are 2 endpoints and a midpoint. You're always going to have 2 of those 3 points. Sometimes you'll have 2 endpoints and looking for the midpoint. Sometimes you'll have an endpoint and a midpoint and you're looking for another endpoint. It's really important to read the question carefully to identify which we have. Okay? If we notice, we read this carefully, both -4, 3 and 10, 1 are referring to endpoints. So I'm going to call this one x1, y1, and I'm going to call this one x2, y2. And again, it's my question here, my mission is to find the coordinates of the midpoint. So I'm looking for x sub m, y sub m. That's what I'm looking for. Okay? So in my equation, if I just scroll up a little bit here, my unknowns are what these equations are solved for, x sub m and y sub m. Those are my unknowns. So here's what I'll say. We'll start with the x midpoint. So I'm going to say x sub m equals. And now I know I have to do, right, as just a reminder, I just have to add my x1 and my x2. So I'm going to add up these and divide by 2. So I'm going to get -4 plus 10 over 2. All right, and I'm just going to break this down. -4 plus 10 is 6. And 6 divided by 2 is 3. So I found x sub m to be 3. I'm not done because I need to find x sub m and y sub m. So I know y midpoint equals the sum of the endpoints divided by 2. I'm going to say y sub m equals 3 plus 1 over 2. 3 plus 1 is 4. 4 divided by 2 is 2. So I have my midpoint then. I'm going to label it as a midpoint. And I'm going to write this in coordinate form as 3, 2. And again, if we look back at our graph, right, let me go ahead and plot those two up here. Just add them into this graph. We had the point -4, 3. So -1, 2, 3, 4. 3 is right here. And my other point, what was it again? And 1. And it's saying my midpoint is 3, 2. That definitely does look like the midpoint. Again, -4 plus 10 divided by 2 is 3. So my x coordinate is at 3. When I add up the two y coordinates, 1 and 3, I divide by 2 and I get 2. Okay. Let's move on to one more type of a problem. Example 2. Okay, so this problem may look very similar to example 1, but the given information is very different here. When we read this, again, when you're doing your homework here, you have to be very careful. It's easy to make a mistake if you're not carefully reading. Because the segment has an end point of -3, 6. So I know -3, 6 is an end point, and a midpoint of 2, -1. So now I know the midpoint and one of the endpoints. My goal is to find the missing endpoint. So here's what I know. I'm going to go ahead and label this. My endpoint is -3, 6. So I'm going to call that x1, y1, because that's the notation I use for one of my endpoints. But this point right here is a midpoint, 2, -1. So I'm going to call it x sub m, y sub m. Okay. It says find the missing endpoint. The only endpoint I haven't given notation for is x2, y2. So I'm going to use the same formula, okay, but my unknown is going to be in a different place. So here's my formula again. So let's start with finding x2. That's my first goal. So I'm going to start with x sub m equals. Which one is my midpoint? Well, that's 2. So I'm going to say 2 equals x sub 1, which is -3, plus x2 over 2. Okay, and now I have to solve this thing. Right, now you guys can solve this equation very simply. Okay, but you have to understand that our unknown here is x2 instead of xm, like in example 1. So first thing I'm going to do is multiply both sides by 2. Cancel. And I'm going to get 4 equals -3 plus x sub 2. And then I'm just going to solve for x sub 2 by, I have to add 3 to get rid of it. I have to add 3. So I know x sub 2 is equal to 4 plus 3, which is 7. Okay, I'm not done because I also need y2. Let's switch colors. Well, here's what I know. I know y sub m equals y1 plus y2 over 2. Well, what was the y coordinate of my midpoint? My ym was -1. So I'm going to say -1 equals, now I need y1. Well, I know that that is 6 back here. So it's going to be 6 plus y2 is my unknown over 2. And again, I'm just going to have to solve this thing. I'm going to solve first by multiplying by 2. 2 times -1 is -2 equals 6 plus y2. And now to get y2 alone, I have to subtract 6 from both sides. -2 minus 6 is -8. And I get my other endpoint coordinate. So then my final answer is, my endpoint is 7, comma, -8. Okay. So we need to be very careful. And this is my final answer. You need to be very careful here to understand what you're missing and how to use that equation, right? It's the same equation I used in example 1 and example 2, but it was different unknowns. All right, that's it for today. I'll see you guys later. Bye.